Good question. I think it's still kind of one of those roles that's not relatively new, but I think the term is still something people... I know anyone that I speak to from the general public, and I say, oh, I was a dramaturg on this production, they go, what does that word mean? But I suppose it's essentially a person who works with the writer, but who is another step away from the writing in terms of, you know, personal investment and attachment, because sometimes a writer wants to say something, but, you know, is very close to the material, and it can be nice to have someone on the outside to go, well, actually, this is how it's reading, this is what it's looking like structurally, this is what the language is sounding like, and giving that feedback for a writer then to return to the work and rework it. Smurf In Wanderland is the story of a Sydney FC fan who decides to go to Western Sydney Wanderers games wearing his Sydney FC shirt, which may sound just kind of like, oh well, that's, you know, I suppose that's an interesting thing to do, but the passion that people feel for those teams, it's really like stepping into enemy territory in a lot of ways, you know, openly declaring yourself on the opposing team. And so David started doing this and kind of making notes and observing and documenting what that experience was like, and from that this show has grown, and through that a lot of interesting things came up, and they have sort of formed Smurf In Wanderland. So it's a show about being a fan of sport, being a fan of football, and what that means personally, and it's also about where you come from and how that informs who you are now. I was in second year at Theatre Nepean, and so it was the first time I'd actually worked on a piece of documentary theatre. We'd done a lot of, you know, Chekhov and Shakespeare and things like this, and suddenly we were looking at the Sea of X incident, which was the asylum seeker boat that sank, and we were looking at, you know, politicians, the transcripts of speeches and Senate inquiry documents, and going, how do we make this theatrical? So that was my first time working with David, and I loved it. I really, really enjoyed that process of exploring that kind of material. People that are familiar with David's work will definitely, you know, be familiar with a lot of the type of content, and yet it also has a deeply personal aspect to it, which is really interesting, because although I'm sure all of David's work is personal, this one I would say is, from my perspective, is probably the most explicitly personal work. So you're getting stories from David's life and his past, which are interwoven with the work that he would more usually make, this documentary style, where we're looking at, you know, journalist articles and language, and you know, the Football Federation Australia, things that they've said, you know, this kind of text and language that is not personal, that is, you know, delivered for other reasons, being brought in alongside David's personal stories and reflections.